Tae-young sat on his knees on the cold marble floor, his body quivering even under the warm air being given out by the heaters present in the room. His hands were bound behind his back, his hands curled into a fist and his head lowered. Suddenly, the sound of door opening resonated in the silent room that had his head moving up from the floor and getting stuck over the dark shadow that stood at the doorstep, tears and the bruises of before left on his body by his step-parents burnt in the cold and sizzled pathetically as the sound of footsteps entering the room entered his ears. He already wasn't safe. His so-called parents beat him and hurt him, the anger they had on their own selves. Tae-young was always the one who always got the punishment for it, starting since he was a kid. He had always been the punching bag for both his mother and older step-brother, who now went abroad for a higher education. Someone was going to touch him, someone he had no idea about. Someone was going to run their dirty hands on his dirty body. Tae-young's already mental instability went worse, as the thoughts rang in his head and ached his wound over his soul and body both even more. The man stood right in front of him, towering him. His breaths echoed in the room, as he stood there watching Tae-young's naked body, where he had nothing on but boxers. Cause he was sent here for the purpose of being accepted by the man who his mother had been caught for stealing, for the watch that belonged to the man's father. Tae-young had no idea what she had been doing, but the man was the customer where his mother worked. He had forgotten his father's most exquisite and expensive and probably rich in emotional value watch there, which unfortunately had been stolen by his mother. Instead of selling it, his brother had gotten his hands on it, or maybe his father, cause when the man came at the house asking for his watch, his mother had cried and begged, telling him that the place where she left it had disappeared from there. Flashback, Tae-young was in his room, applying bandages over the parting whips his brother had given him. He was leaving for his higher education, while Tae-young was allowed to stop his education right to finishing up his higher school. His body was all filled with nothing but the prints left by his mother, father and brother, although he could imagine the disgust his stepmother and father had in him. But he could never know why his own father chose to mendel himself in the acts of brutality done by his mother and brother. Wiping off the tears, he winced as his fingers ended up applying a little to pressure at the wound when he lost himself in the thought. Further cloud of his thoughts was disrupted when sudden noises of screaming, crying and begging entered his ears. Packing up his stuff hastily and wearing a shirt, Tae-young ran downstairs only to find his eyes to have getting stuck over the scene where his mother was on knees in front of some guy he couldn't see, cause his back faced him. Without thinking twice, he yelled, "Hey!" He went and kneeled beside his mother, not even wanting to touch her. He got on his knees and held her shoulders, caressing them. Looking up, he met the dark black eyes of the man, who had long hair that brushed over his temples. His aura was breaking, pretty dominating, and suffocating. He had the kind of air around him that appealed for people for stay, but as well pointed for them to remain at a distance. From the suit and the way bodyguards stood in their little living room, Tae-young could tell that the man was of powerful community. No, he was a powerful community. "Who are you? And what do you want from us?" Tae-young had asked, glaring him, keeping his wavering attitude beneath the cool and rage surface that didn't ripple above, although his insides curled themselves into shorter measures as the man's eyes twitched and his corners of his lips moved slightly, as if he was absolutely pleasant to see something. Well, his eyes were currently on Tae-young, so the man shoved his hands into the pockets of his pants, straightening his head and removing his eyes from Tae-young. He landed them over to his mother. "Get my watch back," he ordered. and his deep, thick voice had Taeyoung's stomach vibrating and his hands sweating from the intensity of darkness present in it. "Or," he muttered, landing his eyes back on Taeyoung, who watched him with nothing but confusion, intimidation and slight fear. "I'll take him." End of the flashback till Jungkook, the owner of millions worth business of jewelry and international association that worked with brands of higher level, had never believed in something that sparked in first sight. Seeing the man to whom he practically owned his life after his father died had him feeling like he was set on the moon. The man whose picture with his father, reading him through his father's words, knowing that this was the one who his father had wished for him to meet, and this man listening to his father on the day he died, had him owing to this man than what he owned at the moment. His heart had already belonged to the man who he knew from the eyes of his father, had seen the first time the last page of his father's journal, spending years with that last remain of him. He had tried to find him, he had done his best, but all his efforts went in vain, until now. Until he saw him, this man who currently sat on his knees naked in nothing but boxers, never looking down at the floor, and keeping his huge galaxy-like blue eyes on him. Jungkook's eyes fell over Taeyoung, and getting his eyes leaving his face and seeing his naked body, his blood boiled, and suddenly, "Jun," he yelled, fisting his hands, glaring the closed door, which immediately opened at his one command, and a man stepped in, bowing before him, who took off his clothes, and who tied him like this. "Did I order you to treat him? Everyone else was treated before." His voice wasn't loud, but his tone spoke volume. There was this glower that was being sent to the guy who had just entered, that Taeyoung knew he would either embrace death than be at the receiving end of it. The man obviously nodded, crossing his hands before himself in respecting gesture. "Sir, we had no idea that." "Who got him ready for me like this?" Jungkook asked instead, cutting the man off. "Jolin, sir." Jungkook nodded, before he waved his hands at the man, before muttering quietly in his deep soul-shaking voice. "Tell him he's fired," Jungkook said, and then had his back greeting the man, who stared him, and then nodding silently. He was about to go out when Jungkook spoke up. "Leave for tonight. I want to be alone for this night with him," Jungkook said, his voice a little gentler than before, but the power and dominance from it wasn't gone. It was still there. The man nodded again, and then left, closing the door behind him. Jungkook got down his knees, reaching Taeyoung's level. His eyes roamed over his face, as if looking for something. But because of the darkness and the lack of lightning in the room, it was strenuous for him to do so. He clicked his fingers, and the lights went on, making Taeyoung flinch at the sudden intrusion and closing his eyes at once. Jungkook didn't move. He kept watching him, until Taeyoung adjusted to the light and finally opened his eyes, matching Jungkook's completely entranced mixed with disbelief eyes. "I've been seeing you," Jungkook muttered under his breath. "I've been looking for you," he breathed out, watching Taeyoung with wide eyes, as if watching Taeyoung for that long. And he still couldn't believe that it was the truth, that Taeyoung was real. Taeyoung's brows furrowed, confusion settling over his features. "What?" he asked, voice dry and thick. What was the man saying? He had literally bought him for the worth of his father's watch, and as much as the watch must have been too much in its materialistic worth. Taeyoung knew, but he was nothing in front of the emotional value of that piece. Jungkook looked at Taeyoung seriously, and let his arms cells around Taeyoung's lean figure, freeing up his hands with a release of small tug. Taeyoung hissed slightly at the bind, leaving his aching wrists, and twisted his wrist, bringing them in front. For most of the part, just like Jungkook's men had thought that Taeyoung was going to run away from Jungkook, Taeyoung looked back at Jungkook, seeing no fear or alert in his limbs. He seemed sure that Taeyoung wasn't gonna run. He believed it. As if he could read past the pages of his heart and know that Taeyoung didn't have any plan of running or getting away. Do you think having me can make up for the watch my stepmother stole? Taeyoung blurted out of curiosity. He knew it would be worth. If it wouldn't have been worth, then Jungkook hadn't taken him and freed his stepmother the humiliation in public. Of course, it would be worth it. He was a boy, and considering the deal, Jungkook was into men, so it would be definitely worth it. But physical pleasure can never bring up the emotional satisfaction of losing one's loved one's last memory and exchanging it with something to pound in. Jungkook held Taeyoung's shoulder, helping him get up, who staggered a little on his step. Jungkook and him stood on the same levels. It will be more than worth it. Course, I already have my father's last memory with myself, right in front of me. Taeyoung sat down with Jungkook on the couch placed in the bedroom. Jungkook had given him clothes earlier, and now both of them sat beside each other, waiting for the explanation. His words hadn't made sense to Taeyoung of Jungkook's words from earlier. He didn't even know many people. He had no idea about these rich people, and especially men like Jungkook and their families. The place he worked was a shithole club. As a bartender, and even more broke people than him arrived there. So, it was hell-lot confusing for him to sit beside the man who held worn him the branded clothes with his own bare hands like he was a child, and he didn't know how to wear clothes. His touch had brushed past his body slightly, and it had left him hanging in the air, silently begging more for the gentle contact. Jungkook's eyes had roamed over the marks, and Taeyoung had felt ashamed of that. He had tried to hide those marks that undoubtedly looked ugly and horrifying over him. At least that was what Taeyoung though. But Jungkook had held his hand and said, "You are beautiful. If you are hiding yourself from my eyes because of the marks, then it shows the ugliness of the people who touched you like that, not you. And if you hide yourself afraid that I'll force myself on you, then I promise never to touch you against your will. I never force myself on anyone. Everyone fall on my bed on their will, and leave on my will. Remember that." Taeyoung looked over to Jungkook from across the couch, taking in his details. Before he could dive himself deeper in the beautiful landscape of Jungkook's skin and his awe-striking features. Jungkook's deep voice spoke up. "The last person my father was with before dying was you," Jungkook revealed, keeping his attention on the lighter that he swirled in his fingers, while his other hands twisted the cigarette. He was suffering from cancer. On the very last stages, it was, when we got to know about it. He didn't had much time left. So he retired early and let my shoulders take the weight of his company that he built up working nights and days of his teenage and adulthood, Jungkook explained. And as much as his face didn't give off anything, Taeyoung, despite being with the man for a short time, he could sense the guilt and anger in his voice as his eyes gave out pain, and exhaustion lingered in his tone. The man was deeper than he assumed in the first meeting. He wasn't really good at reading people, but this time, he could bet that his assumptions was right. Whatever he was feeling and seeing on the top and beneath that man was the truth. "I got busy in the work, and my mother had died when I was 6. He was practically left alone. He called me many times, trying to share things. The movie he watched that day, the story he read, the fantasy of my mother coming to meet him, and eventually complaining how doctors and his nurse kept giving him medicines every second of the day, telling me that he was tired." Jungkook pressed his lips, fisting his hands as the tremors ran through his blood, and Taeyoung noticed his knuckles turning white from the force. Before he could hold himself back, Taeyoung scooted closer, planting himself right beside Jungkook, and let his hand hide away Jungkook's. Jungkook snapped his head towards Taeyoung, their faces intimately close and their eyes staring back in each other. "It's okay. I'm listening. Take your time," Taeyoung said politely. He didn't even know from where the words come, and from where the courage to sit this close to a person who had practically bought him came. All he knew that he couldn't see the man across him, dealing with the rage, guilt and disappointment inside him. That alone. All he knew that he couldn't bear the thought of this man going through something this intense alone, that had his strong body vibrating like a leaf like that. "I was busy," that was what I always told him. "And whenever I was free, whenever I went to meet him, it was only on midnights, and he was fast asleep during that time. I stayed awake beside him, talking to him as he slept, and then left for work. I couldn't meet him and remained busy in tackling the responsibility he had landed over my shoulder," Jungkook said, and then dropped his gaze, looking over to the place where Taeyoung held his hand, placing his other hand on the top of Taeyoung's. Jungkook stroked his knuckles in soothing and a calming manner. "He met you before he died. In the park, beside the hospital he was admitted in." Right then Taeyoung's mind clicked. The Seoul hospital. Jungkook held his hand even tighter, nodding. "Yes. That," he muttered quietly, dropping his head and watching the ceiling as his throat bobbed and hands turned sweaty. He always carried this camera his wife gifted him that on their first date, as a reminder of how he looked more beautiful and handsome than anything they came across on their first date. Flowers, trees, nature's beauty, moon, stars, other men, everything. "Yeah," he horsed out, and then tilted his head to look at Taeyoung. "He took that picture with you and pasting it over his journal. He wrote how he was thankful that you stayed with him from morning to night, listening to whatever he had to say, and helping in letting out everything that he had kept him for too long, and wanted someone to share it with." Jungkook gulped, staring Taeyoung, landing the palm of his hand over Taeyoung's cheek. Jungkook brushed his thumb over the soft expanse of his cheek, stroking it gently, his eyes watching him with gratitude, warmth and need mixed in all the compartment present. "There, he wrote in the end that he wanted that person to be me. But you didn't make him feel as if he had met you for the first time. He wrote about what you shared with him. I'm writing down my own things beside. He shared this wish that he had more time, so he could send us both on a date. He wrote that looking in your eyes, it looked that you needed me, like you were mine, as if my name was written somewhere over you." Jungkook almost said the words in a whisper, and then let his hand slide down until it landed in the curve after Hyung's nape, who hissed slightly at his cold hands meeting his warm heated neck. To say that Taeyoung was 2 seconds away from pinching himself and assuming that he was in a sick dream would be a whole damn lie. Course, it was almost like a fantasy, a novel book he had spent his teenage years reading, the Disney movies kinda thing. He couldn't grasp it all. It didn't feel real, not at all. The way Jungkook looked at him as if he was. No, it couldn't be. The man couldn't be. Jungkook couldn't be in love with him. God, no, he couldn't. How could he? He didn't even know him. He hadn't even seen him in reality, seeing him in the picture captured by the old camera of his father, and reading about him from the words of his father. He couldn't fall for him. Before Taeyoung's mind could unleash more of his thoughts, Jungkook brought himself closer and looked at Taeyoung hesitantly. "Can I hug you? Then, if you want, I'll let you. But for once, please, let me hug you, Taeyoung." Just when Jungkook completed his sentence, Taeyoung didn't give him a moment to even breath after letting out such heavy on-plead words that almost surpassed the indication of begging. He frocked himself forward and, wrapping his arms around Jungkook's waist, he plastered his head over his chest, hugging him tightly as if he was reuniting with a lost part of his soul, a part of his soul that he missed night and day of his whole 25 years of life. Jungkook held him tightly against himself, hiding his fingers into the blonde strands of Taeyoung's, snuggling, his face in his neck and sniffling loudly at the nape of his, breathing him in like he was air who helped him exist in the universe and helped air rushed into his lungs. Taeyoung could even die from the extent of needed Jungkook made him feel in those minutes where he was being hugged by him than he hadn't even felt once in those 25 years of his life. He had never felt wanted or needed before, not even by himself. He had never breathed air like this before. He had never. This time air felt refreshing and life-giving for the first time. Instead of trapping him and caging him in, he felt alive. For the first time, like someone was finally watering the flowers that had already died, and they were being brought back to life once again. And, apparently, that gardener who just stepped in and began making him feel like that, something he couldn't even fantasize in his dreams, was none other than Jeon Jungkook. And the way Jungkook's own arms held Taeyoung, it felt like same thing went with him too, as if Taeyoung somehow helped him get over something he had never expected, as if he was finally winning the battle that his heart and mind had started since the time his father died. 3 years back, I looked at your picture every night before sleeping. I kissed your head every morning. I thanked you every single day and held you like this every time of the day I got the chance to. I talked to you like you were mine. I began dreaming of you like we were us. We all were there. My parents and us. We played in the garden. We cooked together. Taeyoung.